When a healthy baby dies suddenly and unexpectedly, should every factor close in time be examined transparently, or are there some questions that are just simply considered off limits? And today we're going to talk about the retraction of a paper that examined timing and proximity between vaccination and sudden unexpected infant death, and what happens when research is published and accepted as valid on difficult questions like this, and then later removed from the conversation at large from the journals. And so I am joined by renowned research journalist and author Neil Miller to talk about this breaking news and his paper. So thank you so much, Neil, for joining us this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me, Leah. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and I just want to dive right in because when I saw this, what I consider breaking news, I was a little shocked, but then again, we've seen very strange things, so maybe I shouldn't be. And if I just read what it says in the journal where your paper was, it says removal notice to vaccines and sudden infant death, an analysis of the VAERS database from 1990 to 2019. It's a pretty long review. And so it was essentially a review of the medical literature on this question. So tell us what happened with this specific paper. What was it looking at? And then were you surprised to see it retracted?
Well, actually, I have to mention that it wasn't retracted. It was actually removed. That's a step beyond retraction. For example, when Andrew Wakefield's paper was retracted in 2012, people could still go up onto PubMed and read it. But they thought my paper was potentially too dangerous for people to read, so they removed it completely from the scientific records. But it's been out for 5 years. I published that paper it was published in 2021. And in that paper, I looked at three things. The first thing I looked at was the beginnings of sudden infant death and how did we even come to that terminology. Before 1972, we didn't even have something called SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. It was in 1972 that the CDC came up with a new definition because they were having too many cases of cot death. But in the 1960s, the national immunization campaigns took place. So, for example, in the 1940s and 1950s, if you wanted vaccines like DPT, you had to go to your doctor and you had to pay for it out of pocket. But by the 1960s, they started nationalizing everything. And in order to enter school, they started requiring the DPT, the measles vaccine, the mumps vaccine, and the polio vaccine, and then SIDS, or cot death at the time, started to rise, and it became the number one cause of infant death, post-neonatal mortality. And so the CDC came up with a new definition. So at the beginning of my paper, I talk about that type of thing. I also did a study where I downloaded the VAERS database, and I had over 2,000 babies that died from sudden death. I looked at 30 years of data in VAERS, and I put it through a standard scientific test and found that babies were dying more often within 1 day, 3 days, and 7 days after they got their vaccines. I looked at a 60-day period. All the deaths were clustering around the time of the vaccines. And that was a significant part of my study. And then the third part of my study was where I looked at all of the other research that was done since the 1930s on cot death or sudden baby death right up to the present time, which was 2021, right before I published it. So it was quite an extensive paper, and it was recited by many scientists. Many, when they saw the paper and they were writing their own papers, they thought it was important to cite this paper and to talk about it. Now, when the paper first came out, a lot of people complained about it. The pro-vaccinators looked at everything and they tried to tried to find fault with it, but it stayed published for almost 5 years. And then in December of last year, I received an email from the editor of the journal that published it, Toxicology Reports. And he said multiple people are complaining about this paper or critiquing this paper, and he wanted me to respond to their concerns. So he gave me 2 links. One was a link to PubMed, which was somewhat valid to place your concerns in there, and one was on social media. So, I'm supposed to respond to complaints on social media. In the old days, you had to contact the journal and you had to write your own paper to lay out the complaints that you have about it. But that wasn't the case. He said, I want you to respond to this. You have 30 days. That took place immediately after my paper was published in 2021. They weren't recent complaints. So they were all the similar complaints to what I've dealt with in the past. By the way, if you write papers that show problems with vaccines, they really come after you. They try to take it down and they do everything they can to harass the journal editors and to get your paper retracted, or in my case, completely removed. But there were 8 complaints. It was all from one woman. And I was told that she's a regular. She constantly goes after papers and claims a lot of problems with papers. So anyway,
Is she a research
responded to
journalist
all.
herself?
What's that?
Was this woman who complained, was she a research journalist herself, or could you tell any interest or ties that she had in the subject?
Yeah, and I responded to them thoroughly, and none of them had validity, not retraction worth. 6 of them were just nonsense, and 2 of them were interpretive. And then they got back to me, and I heard from the ethics committee of Elsevier, that's the parent journal of Toxicology Reports. And he said that it was unsatisfactory and they were going to remove my paper, which means it would be removed from the scientific records. And he said that there were 2 reasons. One was there were methodological errors, and 2, it was potentially too dangerous for the public to read this, which is ridiculous.
They like to claim that the public is too immature or stupid to understand facts and transparency. I mean,
That's right.
my understanding of your paper is we have to expose that healthy babies don't just die, and families deserve complete transparency. They deserve us unturning every stone when a baby dies unexpectedly and suddenly. And so, what was your original impetus for even diving into this specific paper? Because I know you've done a lot of research, you've covered a lot of medical literature and written papers. And so, why'd you take up this specific paper to begin with?
Well, it's the same reason I've done all my other research. It's to provide parents with full transparency. It's to provide parents with the opportunity to make truly informed decisions. Because when parents only get one side of the story, they can't make safe choices for their own children. And so I decided to dive deep into the sudden infant death syndrome problem and to make it available to everybody so that they could decide for themselves whether they wanted to risk the chances that their child would have problems, or if they thought that the vaccines would provide them with a safe haven. Every parent is entitled to all of the available information. I fought Dr. Lash. He's the editor-in-chief of Toxicology Reports, and I challenged the fellow from the ethics committee, Dr. Pappy, and I was actually absolutely opposed to their claim that my paper had methodological flaws. And I told them, I said, you know what, if you want to remove this paper, go ahead. That's your prerogative. I don't agree with it, but do not say that there's methodological flaws if you won't tell me what they are, okay? Because they wouldn't tell me. They say in their removal notice they claim that there's methodological flaws. Now, that's a slight against me.
Well, wouldn't they have
And
known? Wouldn't they have known about the methodological flaws before they decided to publish? Because normally, if you retract or remove a paper, it's based on new undisclosed information, like you had hidden information, or there's new information that makes the conclusion dramatically different. So, was it new information, or was this all information that they should have known when they made the original decision to publish?
no, it was a different editor in chief when my paper was accepted. It went through complete peer review, and then they brought at the end of 21, they brought in Dr. Lash, and he is a head of a lot of pharmaceutical journals, and he's associated with big pharma. When they decided to investigate my paper, Dr. Peter McCullough was giving a lot of talks at various conferences, and he was referencing my paper, and he was discussing all the statistics in that paper. And Dr. Pierre Corey was on Children's Health Defense TV several times, and he was discussing my paper and talking about it. And this was just prior to when they contacted me to investigate it. They were probably going to let it go if it wasn't making waves. But once they were concerned that it was going to gain more traction and more people going to read it, they wanted to nip that in the bud. So I think that was the reason. Now, the one potential problem that they could hold me to in my paper is what they call reporting bias, because my statistics, when they came back, it was 25% of all babies were dying within 24 hours from getting
Wow.
after they got their vaccines. 50% of all the reports in VAERS were the babies were dying within 3 days, and 75% were dying within 1 week. But you could argue that this was associated with reporting bias because parents are more likely to report something if it happens in close proximity to it. In every scientific paper, the author is required to list the strengths and list the weaknesses. And, I listed VAERS has certain weaknesses, and I talked about reporting bias. But I also discovered that most of the deaths were taking place on day 2, not on day 1. And this is evidence of toxicity. So basically, babies are getting that vaccine, and then they're not quite succumbing on day 1, most of them, okay? But then on day 2, the numbers skyrocket. Babies succumb to those vaccines on day 2. And that is evidence of a biological toxicity.
Did the paper go as far as to say that vaccines cause sudden infant death?
No,
Because
no, I
you know,
never made that claim.
and to overcome things like reporting bias, we're going to have better data to pull from. I mean, you did a 30-year review out of a database where people are reporting incidents. But the sad thing is, the data does not exist in an easily accessible way to look at vaccination in proximity to sudden unexplained infant death, because things like the authorities eliminating prophylactic vaccination as an official cause of death. I mean, that was removed by the medical authorities some years ago. And now what do the doctors do with that? How do they even talk about vaccination and death? Like, what are you seeing with the need for better reporting on this specific factor?
Well, we need other databases. Now, the VSD is the Vaccine Safety Data Link. This is a very excellent database for finding data like whether or not vaccines cause autism. It's basically from 11 of the largest health systems in the country. For the last 30 years, they've got every child that came through the system, every vaccine that child got, and every disease or every diagnosis that was made on that child. So that's the kind of data that's in there. Dr. Marks, I think he was from the FDA, he took the database out of the HHS's hands. He took the database and he said, we're not going to let RFK Jr. have this database because we think he's going to fudge the results. He's going to create some nonsense. That's what I was afraid of. Not that Bobby was going to create nonsense. I was afraid of if Bobby didn't get a hold of that database as soon as possible, they would manipulate the data and then they would give it to him so that Bobby couldn't find anything. I was very surprised that they just completely took the database out of his hands. So now he has to go looking for other databases. He's gone to state, I believe it's Medicaid, but no matter what he finds, they won't believe him because it's a major cover-up. These guys are responsible, at least back since the Simpsonwood debacle back in 1999 and 2000. If they go back, at least CDC is known for at least 26 years that vaccines were causing autism. They know it, okay? And instead of saying we made a mistake or we prescribed these vaccines and it's causing autism in a certain percentage of babies. If they did that and came clean, we wouldn't be here today. But they decided, well, we'll just keep going for 26 more years, damaging these kids, causing all sorts of disabilities. Autism is just one of the disabilities. Sudden infant death is the worst kind of disability you can imagine. Brian Hooker and I did 2 studies. We compared vaccinated children to unvaccinated children, and we showed that they had increased rates of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and allergies. And we did another study, and it showed an increase of autism and neurological disorders and various other types of disabilities. These 2 studies are very important. And now that paper has a notice of concern that people are complaining about that. And that was published before my SIDS paper. And they're investigating and contemplating taking that paper down.
Which is that the same journal or a different journal?
It's a different journal. The chronic disease epidemic in the 1960s, 6% of all kids had a chronic disability. Today, it's anywhere from 52 to 76%. This is not normal. This is a direct result of the vaccines.
Right. It's common, but not normal. We cannot rewrite normal for the sake of our children's welfare. And when you look at your paper with the SIDS and the proximity of vaccination, it is fair that parents should have transparent information on medical interventions and bad health outcomes. Like looking at health history with health outcomes makes perfect sense when it comes to making good healthcare decisions. Vaccines are said to be the foundation of pediatric healthcare in America. That is admitted by the CDC, by our hospital systems, by the WHO, that vaccination is the foundation. Yet when a child loses their life, it's off the table to talk about the vaccine program. And we passed a law this year in 2 states, Oklahoma and Louisiana, that said you have to record vaccine status as a part of the coroner's investigation. And when you're looking at sudden unexplained death in people under certain ages, in one of the states it was 20 and under, and the other state was 15 and under. And that does not imply causation. It's data gathering. It's transparency. And our model bill is going to require that the inclusion in state infant mortality reports. And do you think that could be one solution to us getting more transparency, is having each state have to include this status in the infant mortality reports?
Yeah, that's one possibility. Dr. Blaylock said that the industry is much more interested in protecting the vaccine program than they are protecting children. And that's a big part of the problem. All these people, like the CDC, FDA, World Health Organization, and all the journals, they're all in cahoots. It's basically a cover-up, and they're all responsible for these deaths of our children. Now, the CDC had access to the VSD, the Vaccine Safety Data Link. They control it. It's jointly owned, and they could have done the vaccinated, unvaccinated study. They can still do the study. They refuse. There's only one reason why they refuse to do it. That's because they know what they'll find. And so there's lots of ways we can solve this problem, but it hasn't been solved. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've been writing about vaccines for 40 years. My children are over 40. I started investigating vaccines when they were born. And, I had to go to the medical libraries to get my information. The internet wasn't even available when I started investigating.
Think we're closer? Do you think we're getting at all closer to transparency around health outcomes and vaccines?
I think with COVID, they overextended their hand. They pushed really hard on mandating it, and a lot of people saw through that. There was about 30% of the population that refused to get the vaccine. But vaccination rates for the childhood vaccines are still 90 to 95%. So that speaks to how much progress are we making?
You
It
know
was
that the WHO has a term for that, Neil. The WHO's term for a child with no vaccinations is a zero-dose child. And if you look at them having a term for that, they set out one of their objectives in their 10-year plan, because they always have their 10-year health plan. So for 2030, their goal is to cut the zero-dose children, to identify them, sniff them out, and cut the zero-dose children in half by 2030.
because they want to get rid of the control group. You see, as soon as they get rid of everybody that's unvaccinated, they can breathe easier because they can no longer prove them culpable, responsible for what they've done for the last 30 years or 40 years, really. More than that. The British had a huge population that fought Jenner. In 1796 was when Jenner came out with his original studies on smallpox. There was huge population that was fighting mandated vaccines, and the British government was fining everybody that wasn't getting vaccinated and forcing them to get vaccinated. So periodically throughout history, there were huge amounts of people that were fighting this. But here we stand with a very large number of parents that still vaccinate their children almost completely with every vaccine that is recommended. But I'll tell you, this is one of my last interviews, actually, on this issue that I'm going to be giving because, I've put in my time. I put in a lot of time on this, and I keep getting pulled back in, and I have a lot of information in my head that, I have mixed feelings about completely letting this issue go. But there's a lot more people fighting it right now. There was no Del Bigtree. There was no Bobby Kennedy when I came out. The only person that was out here when I was speaking out was Barbara Loe Fisher. But we were essentially the only two. Her organization was a big organization. It did a lot of good, and I really thank her for all the work she's done and still does a lot of work.
You certainly have been one of those that we get to stand on the shoulders of. I mean, your book of the 400 studies is such an invaluable resource. I mean, almost every mom I talk to that digs into making their own vaccine decision, Neil Miller's book was their first book, that 400 studies book, and is inspired so many to read research studies, to actually not feel too stupid or too incapable of being confident in the decisions that you make. And you're coming to the end of an amazingly valuable career. Like, you've served the public in an unmeasured way. So are there studies that stand out to you? Like, when you think back to that book or to your life's work, like, what is the study you think opens the most people's eyes?
The sad truth is that most parents don't open their eyes until their own child has been damaged by vaccines and they see it with their own eyes. I've talked to so many parents. I've had the same conversation. I've gotten so many emails. Parents say, Mr. Miller, please, I've taken my doctor to the 2-month vaccines, and the child ended up in the hospital, and he was fighting for his life. And then he got out of the hospital, and it came time for the 4-month vaccines. And I took him. I didn't want to take him. I argued with the doctor. I told him that I thought that the vaccines caused my child to end up in the hospital. He said that it had nothing to do with it. And he said the vaccines are very important. And so I got the vaccines again, and my child ended up in the hospital again, this time for 2 weeks. And then he came out again. And then it was time for 6-month vaccines. And now I don't know what to do, whether I should get the 6-month vaccines or not. And I think, you don't know what to do? What happened to your maternal instinct? Because, you were given a maternal instinct to protect your baby, protect your child under any conditions. And so I've heard that story that I gave you in one of its numerous variations, dozens of times. And it's just so it's not a particular study that will change parents' minds. It's really, it's when their own child gets hurt and they see it for their own eyes and they know it. And even then, they still want to know if they should get additional vaccines.
They want to ask, is it worth it? Is it worth the hospital visit? Is it worth, them living at a compromised vitality to save their life from polio? And that's, you don't know how many moms I hear similar stories from as you. And what gets me the most is when I hear a mom say, I didn't know that I could say no. And that goes back to that maternal instinct of, this is your child. You are charged with the care and concern of this child, and you should go to the ends of the earth to make your own decisions for the child without the state's influence, the school's influence, even the doctor's influence on the ultimate decision. And that's why we think like going after the medical mandates is one of the cores of this so that moms can simply know that this is their choice and their baby.
Yeah, that was what I believed in from the beginning. I represented 2 issues. One was everybody should be free to have access to all the available information, and they should be free to accept or reject the vaccines. And I was always for not mandating vaccines. You had to look at ridiculous vaccines like, chickenpox. They didn't have to come out with a chickenpox vaccine. It doesn't kill anybody. And those that it does kill, it's usually they've had pre-existing conditions already that makes them much more susceptible to problems. So each vaccine causes a series of additional problems that have to be looked at and considered in the overall picture.
And I think that, many moms start approaching, like you said, with individual interventions because to throw out a whole class of drugs makes sense to some people, but not to others. You know what I mean? Like vaccines as a class of a medical intervention. But there's also some people are starting to go back to respecting what is natural, respecting our God given programming. And that's really a worldview. I mean, if you really stop and look at is artificial programming of our immune system superior to natural programming of our immune system? These exposures and upgrades, we get genetic upgrades every single time we change our ecosystem, every single time we interact with those around us, like we're genetically upgrading, and that comes to viruses too. It's interesting because I think there's so many different reasons that are bringing people to re-examine their decision when it comes to their immune system.
Well, when my wife and I were pregnant with our first child, I had researched vaccines extensively. I had to do my due diligence. Now, we did not vaccinate our children. We did not go to a medical doctor until my daughter was 16 years old and she tore her top of her ear, and we went to the medical doctor. Even then, I was like, I wasn't sure if I wanted to take her to the emergency ward. I was thinking about duct taping it.
Super glue?
Together.
Just super glue it, right?
I I was gonna duct tape it, but, we took her to the emergency medical care. My wife breastfed them for over 2 years. Um, so we did absolutely everything naturally, and, now most people won't be like that, but it's there, it's available, and you can do it if you make that choice. You don't have to take the vaccines, you don't, but you do run a risk. If you don't take the vaccines, you do run a risk of getting the vaccine related disease. If you take the vaccine, you also run the risk of getting the various adverse side effects, and they can be severe all the way up to and including death. So it's a decision that every parent has to make.
Some people who have, I don't know if you've done research on this, but have an opinion that if you take the vaccine and you don't get evidence of the measles virus, you don't have the classic symptoms, the symptoms are not there, that doesn't mean that your body isn't mediating it or that we've suppressed the measles virus deeper into the child at a cellular level. And so have you done research on, is it true that measles is gone if you don't see measles?
You mean from civilization, public,
Or even from a specific person's body, that if a child gets vaccinated for measles and
if
never.
you get vaccinated for measles, you don't have lifelong immunity. That's why whenever an unvaccinated person comes into contact with a vaccinated person, if the unvaccinated person has measles, they'll pass it on to the vaccinated person. The only way you get lifelong protection is if you actually contract measles naturally. Childhood diseases have a very specific purpose. Prime your immune system. Children get growth spurts after measles. They become stronger and their immune system becomes more mature after measles. Remember, before vaccines, this is how Mother Nature made a stronger species by winnowing out the runts from society. Now, that's a nice way of saying a few people died from these various diseases to make a stronger total species. But Mother Nature only cares about the species. And, if you get that vaccine, you're not protected for life like you are if you get the natural disease. And people have to realize that. And that's why they're so afraid of the non-vaccinated. But the answer isn't to make the non-vaccinated get the vaccine. The answer is for the pharmaceutical companies to go back to the drawing board. Let them design a vaccine that works for the people that take it. That's the way that every other drug in society works. What am I going to blame my neighbors if a vitamin or a drug that I take doesn't work? And I'm going to ask my neighbors to make sure that they take this drug so that I'm safe? That's a ridiculous proposition. And so the manufacturers got to go back to the drawing board. That's why they came up with the chickenpox vaccine. They were originally designing the chickenpox vaccine for people that, I think the people that had leukemia. It was specifically designed for them. But then they figured out that they couldn't make enough money for the amount of people that had leukemia. So they petitioned the FDA to license it, to, certify it as safe. It came out in 1995. They actually claimed a mother wouldn't have to stay at home to take care of her sick baby. That was the rationale for putting a chickenpox vaccine on the market. People forget that these vaccines are drugs. I tell people, when did you last take 8 drugs at the same time? When you take one drug, it has a certain profile where you'll have a certain number of people will have adverse effects. If you take 2 drugs, you have it's additive effects or synergistic. 8 vaccines at 2 months of age. They get 8 more vaccines at 4 months of age, and 9 vaccines at 12 months of age. They used to contain mercury and aluminum. 5 of those vaccines had mercury, and several of them had aluminum. Now, they got rid of most of the mercury, but some of the aluminum is still in them. If you took eight drugs at the same time, would you be more surprised if you did or did not have an adverse reaction? So, it's just all
And
of
if
it
you
is common sense.
And if you don't have a reaction, you might want to wonder, like, is my body awake? Is it responding to the things I'm putting into it? Because every response is the body telling you something. And, we wrote a book recently. We published it last November that you forwarded. And we're so grateful that we get your forward on that book that shows moms why each and every dose was justified on the pediatric schedule. So, just like you said with chickenpox, why was that originally considered as a part of routine childhood healthcare?
It's a
And
moneymaker.
when parents understand that, when parents understand why each and every dose earned its spot on the schedule, then I pray that they can be more confident in making their own decision and not ever second guessing. Like, oh, if my child comes up against health adversity, was it my fault? We're all going to have adversity. We're all going to have to build resilience in this journey. And making the best decision possible for your child is noble. It's not cowardly to go against compliance measures. And I know I told you we would only take an hour of your time, and I'm so thankful that we got to talk about the breaking news with your paper and that healthy babies don't just die. But I also want to just ask you before we leave, like, is there one piece of parting wisdom that from your work that you wish that people would be able to harness?
I wish that parents would do their own research and make their own decisions in concert with all the research that they've investigated, and be not afraid to stand up against the forces that are telling you that you must vaccinate. It's very scary. And so I would say knowledge is power, and you should gain as much knowledge as you can about these vaccines until you're confident in your decisions. Don't pass those major decisions onto your doctor to make those decisions for you, because you will be left with the damaged child to take care of. Keep in mind that vaccines are not some miracle products. They're drugs. They call them biologics, and the FDA does that, but whether they call them vaccines, biologics, it doesn't matter. They're drugs, and they're drugs with very powerful adverse effects as a potential. So my piece of advice would be that parents have to gain knowledge, have to gain strength, have a support system when you go to the doctor. Stand tall, stand strong with whatever decisions your family has made with regard to vaccines.
So good. I can't thank you enough for the decades of work that you have done. I know that this area of work is not something that earns you a lot of badges or earns you fame or fortune, but you have certainly impacted millions of lives. And I can say that with confidence. So thank you so much, Neil, for joining us today. And, we want to get the word out about the paper that you published and why it was retracted so parents do understand that it is their choice with each and every healthcare decision. So
Well,
thanks again.
you're welcome. I'm publishing a book, and it will include that study. It will include all my correspondence with Elsevier, their so-called ethics person, and with the toxicology reports. And it will include AI's interpretation of that study, and that will come out. And people can get my books if they want from Amazon, or they can go to VacBook, VacBook.com.
VACBOOK.com VacBook. And we will be sure to let our audience know as soon as your new book comes out about this breaking news, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.